a sec. Right, so thank you all for making it to this final session of this workshop, which I really, really enjoyed. I will put the videos up on our YouTube channel, a new YouTube channel, which goes with our new website. So the website again is FWIRN, Future of Work and Income Research Network.co.uk. If you go there, there's a link to the YouTube channel, and there you'll be able to find all of the recordings for these sessions, so you can watch the ones you missed or send them to your friends or whatever else you'd like to do with them, except sell them, obviously. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Bertrand Rossert, who contacted us just after we'd started the network. He works at the ethics department of the World Bank on issues to do with work there. So we're very, very fortunate to have him in our network and to have us here today to speak about defining work. Thank you, Bertrand.
So thank you very much. I've got a few slides, so let me put the slides up. Okay, can you all see the slides?
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so let me stay on this one for a minute to say that, of course, defining work is really important and interesting in my practice because I'm basically working on the ethics of work and on working practices within the World Bank. I believe also that if we have a good definition of work, we then have a good definition of development. But I would like to emphasize that all these views that I'm presenting are my own, and that they cannot be attributed to the World Bank, and they're not an official position in any way. I think it will become pretty obvious from the content, but I wanted to make it explicit. So the agenda, we're going to start by looking at a number of references. I'm going then look at a few case studies, then proposing that actually we should not think in terms of work or non-work, but have a trichotomy. Then actually look at a more positive definition of work, because very often work is defined as work is not non-work. And so I'd like to try and propose a more positive definition based on actually what work is used for. And that will then bring me to a few futuristic thoughts about what's going to happen to work with the growth of artificial intelligence. So, since I'm connected from Washington, D.C., you will have not only, French accent creeping in, but probably American spelling on top. So I hope it will not make you cringe too much. So first, let's look at a number of historical references. I'm not going to delve very much into Aristotle. It's more just to say that from actually the works of French historians like Paul Venn or Jean-Pierre Vernant, it seems that work as a category of activities is not something that existed in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. So it's something relatively recent. So then I've looked at a few more recent philosophers, or in the case of Max Weber, sociologists, who have actually been developing theories that are based on work or largely used work. So first of all, Marx. First of all, Adam Smith. Let's go chronologically. And well, Adam Smith uses the work quite a few times. I'm giving you there the exact count. And basically, he simply defined works as providing the necessaries and conveniences of life. But what is the process? What is the content of work? You don't get that from Adam Smith. So then we can look at Marx. I mean, Marx actually mentions labor nearly, over 4,500 times in the Capital, or in the first book, actually, and 2,600 times the work. Yet there isn't a definition. So then you've got the famous essay of Max Weber on Protestant ethics, which is basically, in his view, based on work, and the word work, only appears 5 times in the book and is not defined. So, what's the consequences of not defining these terms? I mean, for Marx, for instance, it is pretty devastating if you're looking at it from a sort of analytical point of view, because Marx has a theory of value, which is basically value is defined, is calculated by reference to the content of labor or work that is embedded in an object or in an activity. Okay, but if work is not defined, then value is not defined with that definition of Marx, and basically, the Marxian theory of value collapses. So I think actually work is a little bit like the cooking in the sense that there's really an ontological problem with that. We know when we're cooking, we know when we're working, but it's incredibly difficult, as Claude Lévi-Strauss discussed in Le Cru et le Cuit, to define actually what cooking is, and similarly, it's extremely difficult to define what work is. So I spend a lot of my time actually trying to convince my colleagues that a philosophical approach is interesting in a business context. So slightly mischievously, I'm going to do the opposite here and use actually a classic technique of business, which is using case studies to actually look at the difficulties of definitions of work. So let's look at the first one. You all know this guy. And let's imagine that Gordon Ramsay, the cook, is cooking. And the question is Gordon Ramsay working? And surprisingly, the answer is, well, it depends. If he's actually cooking a Christmas pudding on television, he's working. If he's actually cooking Christmas pudding in his laboratory to actually define the menu of a restaurant, he's cooking. If he's cooking the Christmas pudding at home, he's not working. If he's cooking for friends, he's not working. So there, the first aspect of just looking at cooking is that the nature of the activity is not sufficient to define work. The finality of the activity and the environment where the activity is performed will also influence the definition. So let's look at the second example, which is the lift. Or first time I talked about the lift in this country, I was actually guided to a forklift because they tend to call that an elevator. But here, that's what I'm talking about, something which goes up and down between floors. So imagine that I'm going to the 5th floor, and then someone comes in and wants to go to the 8th floor. I'm in front of the set of the keyboard, and the person says, can you press 8th floor, please? Which I do. And that's it. I will leave at the 5th floor, and she will go to the 8th floor, or vice versa. I could actually stop at the 5th floor, let her go out, and then go to the 8th floor if I went to the 8th floor. And the question is, am I working when I do that? Most of us would say, no, you're not working. But then you look at the picture at the bottom and you see this guy whose job it was to just operate a lift. And in fact, Jean Baudrillard once mentioned that there were about 10,000 people employed as lift operators in New York alone about 100 years ago. So what made it work at one point and not work now? First of all, it's the time spent doing it. It's also the level of effort. At one point, lifts were considered a little bit tricky. You had a grid to operate, and so it was also possibly a little bit more dangerous. And initially you had to operate levers, etc. And then gradually with technological progress, it became easier and easier until the point when we could do it ourselves. But what's interesting here is to see that an activity which is at one point in history defined as work can end up being defined as an activity which, it's not really leisure, it's not really work, it's not really a private activity, it's just there. When it's fly fishing, okay, that's my opportunity to show off. The guy at the top is me, the guy at the bottom is a guide. And so the paradox here is that when I'm fishing at the top, the guide is just watching. So easy working. And what's interesting here also is that we actually hooked the fish you see at the bottom. But unfortunately, that fish took me to a big tree trunk, and so I lost that fish on that day. The guide, who was actually having a day off the following day, went back to the same place, caught the fish. That's the second picture. So that brings me to two interesting aspects here. First, this, repetition in effort is not going to be sufficient to define work, because I'm actually the one making more efforts when I'm fly fishing and the guide is watching me. I'm also taking it seriously, making more physical efforts that I do in my normal work. But then I put the fish back, and so I don't produce anything tangible, and so that's usually considered as a leisure activity. By contrast, because the guide hasn't got use of his free time and he's with me, this is considered work. Now, what's interesting in this story, the second story I told you of when he went back to catch the fish, that the work-relevant information is not initially captured during work only, and information relevant to non-work activities can actually be captured during work. So that also blurs the distinction quite a bit. Let's go now to the case of another hobby and passion of mine, which is pot making or pottery. So let's imagine that we have somebody who is using clay to make bricks. Everybody's going to say that that's work. Then we have Helena, who makes pots and sells them at the local market. And most of us will say that this is work. Although some people will ask how many pots she sells, how long during a week does she spend making pots, and maybe if you only do it a day a week, some people will question whether this is really work. Which is interesting actually when we start discussing 4-day weeks or 3-day weeks, because then if we start saying that an activity which is done only for part of the week becomes leisure, that also will blur the distinctions when you go into reduction of work week. Now imagine another potter who is working actually full time during the week, but has never managed to sell a pot because her pots are really not very good. So is that work? Then we've got Athena, who takes Penelope's pots, but she's actually very good at selling, so she manages to sell the pots. So if Athena is able to sell the pots for Penelope, does this change anything? to the to the nature of sorry, lost my file on the sides. That's okay. Does it show anything to the nature of Penelope's activity? Now imagine that Athena is actually not selling the pots. She's hiring somebody to sell the pots for her. Does it mean that Athena is still working when she hires somebody to do the work for her? Then imagine that Athena, in fact, is not really hiring someone, she's just asking a friend. So in the first case, she's asking a friend and she's going to pay. We're probably going to say that the friend will be working, Athena, because there's an exchange of money, will also be working. But let's imagine that Athena simply says to her friend, oh, you're selling vegetables, it would be nice for you to be selling pots at the same time. I'll buy you coffee, and but the coffee is not really a full exchange of the sort of monetary value that the activity of Aphrodite is going to extract for Athena. And when Athena comes back with the 2 coffees, the pots are sold. So does it mean that actually Athena was working when she went to fetch the coffees or not? So we see that there are all sorts of definitional problems. Now let's go to the drowning child. So somewhat mischievously, as ethicists will notice, I've called this guy Peter. He's making bricks and he's working, but suddenly he hears a child drowning. He goes to the river, he rescues the child, and the question is, was he working? Was he rescued the child? And most of us will say no, he's working when he's laying bricks or making bricks, but not when he's rescuing the child. Aha! What is the most socially valuable activity he's made during that day? Is it making a few bricks that, I purposefully put a picture here of a brick maker from Africa, because there he's, the value of his work is going to be a few dollars. By contrast, saving a child, is almost incommensurable. So we suddenly, on this example, have a situation where an activity which is not work is actually more valuable than an activity which is clearly defined as work. And now, would the repetition change anything? Imagine that he's next to the river and every day he rescues a child. Will you start saying that because of that repetition, he's working when he rescues a child? Or would you say that only if he gets paid for it, is he working? So it seems that now we can't really define work as Adam Smith was doing by the finality of work, because some activities are actually more socially worthwhile. Now let's look at a really complex case. I'm not sure you recognize anybody on the top picture, but there's a guy called Ludwig. He designs a house, and the question is whether he's working if he designs a house and likes it. And now I need to tell you that he's not necessarily getting paid for it. The house is for his sister. Does this change your view in any way? And here you see him in uniform. He's going to war. He's taken prisoner. Is the fact of going to war a work activity? Is being a prisoner a work activity? And then Ludwig, during his spare time, is also writing in a number of books. Some are black, some are blue. And the question is whether he's working when he's doing that. And frankly, I think it depends on the quality of what he's writing. Of course, the guy at the top of the picture is that one, it's Wittgenstein. And when we start thinking of the black book and the blue book, we start thinking really of contributions to humanity. But then they would not, before I actually showed you the picture of Wittgenstein, you would not necessarily have categorized the fact of scribbling in a blue book or a black book as a work activity. So I think the problem here is that we define work and non-work, and we need to be much more complex. So I think also we need to, work is always surrounded by an ethics of work, and I'll come to that in, defining what I call an ideology of ethics. And I think basically we sort of starting with two assumptions which in my view are questionable. One is that there's work and everything else is non-work. And the second is that we consider that work is more valuable than non-work. But I've given you examples that challenge both. So then what I'm proposing is to go with 4 principles. One is that the individual relies in some way on the social group to get more out of belonging to the group than not, and vice versa. The individual will contribute sufficiently to the social group so that the social group has an interest in having that individual as a member. And that, for game theorists, is very, very close to what's called the Nash equilibrium. Then we also have to add that the individual has the obligation to contribute to the social group when the cost of doing so is clearly outweighed by the benefits to society, and then the individual has the freedom of working or not working or contributing, as condition A, when he chooses. And these, I think, are basically defining our sort of work activity at the moment. Okay, my slides. And I think now we need to, on that basis, we need to forget about the work, non-work definition and go to a more complex one. I think it's a continuum, but that continuum can be characterized almost as a trichotomy. You have the private activities, which usually are not going to be remunerated. That will involve cooking, that will involve looking at your children, that will involve sometimes repairing the house, cleaning the house. That will involve also writing in a black book, if this writing is only interesting for yourself. Then there's work, and then there are at the extreme contributions to humanity. So it doesn't really matter whether, whether Newton was really working when he was in a farm inventing calculus during the plague. It's probably, we can sort of exclude that from work and consider that as a contribution to humanity. So if you apply that to my examples and paradoxes, a lot of them disappear. Because then you really, you haven't got a paradox with Wittgenstein, and basically when he goes to war, because that's destructing social worth, in fact, or resources, that's not work. In the same way, being prisoner is not work. But in the same way, or in a different way, writing the blue book and the black book are not work either, they're contributions to humanity. So then that led me to look at the interface between here private activities and work, and look a little bit at tipping. And tipping is interesting because you've got a reversal of the power relationships. And normally when you buy something, the supplier is going to tell you how much it is, and on that basis you will decide whether you want it or not. With tipping, you do something and the consumer will actually decide whether or not to give you any remuneration for it and the level of remuneration. So it's interesting because then the governance of work changes, and so that's basically at the interface between private activities and work. So at that level, it's interesting to see that it's basically the consumer who decides whether it's work or not, and characterizes at work by giving a tip. And in the same way, you have the same at the other end. Like the child who was saved by Peter from drowning has no way of remunerating Peter for it. He will be enormously grateful, but there's no way he can repay that. That's a contribution to humanity. So in some ways, and contribution to humanity is actually, if you look at it, are usually far less remunerated than some work activities. Now, I have given you so far a sort of definition of work by contrast with other things. But so work stays an empty shell if we do that. So how could we define work? And so I thought about this and realized that it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to define work by its finality, or work by what is being produced or how it's being produced. But in fact, the real finality of work might not be production. It might actually be to give you a seat or give you a place in the allocation game. So in society, you don't necessarily work because you want to produce something. You work because you want the resources that go with it. And so this is how we actually tend to allocate, to define work. And I think it's through allocations, and these are tremendous consequences. So that's counterintuitive for economists, and that really is a game changer. Let me give you just a quick scenario to try to convince you. I tried to look at abstract arguments, but I think this one in some ways is easier. I mean, you can also think of it as parents. You tell your children, oh, you should really go into garbage collection because humanity really needs that. It's poorly paid, but it's really useful. Or do you tell your children, you should actually become a tax lawyer because you're going to earn a lot of money by helping people actually find tax loopholes? I think there are more people saying the latter than the former. And here, basically build a case, similarly in saying, okay, you've got a hedge fund manager says, I'm a hedge fund manager because I earn lots of money doing it. Or you have someone saying, okay, I'm going to give up my job as a hedge fund manager because I think I can be more useful as a farm worker because we really need to produce farm. And even if the pay is lousy, I don't think this happens. And so then the argument, the economic argument is, well, yes, but in fact, the value of work is going to be decided by the value of the production, etc. Well, actually, and being an economist, I actually don't think it's the case. I think there are so many social differentiations of types of work that, in fact, this is more prominent and this is more important than really the value of what is being produced. We have distinctions, and we had distinctions throughout the ages between noble work and servile work. And that's introduced, by the way, by Aristotle. There's work that is chosen and work that is unavoidable, work that helps you grow your mind, Aristotle again, and work that exhausts your body. Clean work and dirty work, or work that will protect the whole society. That's how, for instance, the priests and the armies were considered in the Middle Ages, and that meant that they were remunerated by the rest of society, because after all, the farmer will only benefit a few, while a priest praying for humanity was benefiting the whole society. And then I thought also that we end up, in fact, in society, having what I call a governance of work And we divide basically people in society in basically 3 categories. Those who are not good enough for work, and that will include, for instance, the children, they're not ready, that, you know, or that's the modern way of thinking about it. There'll be those who work or who are able to work and looking for a job, and those who are dispensed from work by society, like the nobility in the past, or in England still, and the retirees. And so this is going to, all these social determinations of work are going to play on, you know, the allocation game, what I call the allocation game, which is the allocation of resources. And this is a bigger determining factor than really what is going to be produced in the end. And you can all think about useless jobs, you can think of useless products being produced, and people actually, you know, getting remunerated for it quite a bit, and considering that they work quite a bit doing it. So then that brings me to also the ideology, what I call the ideology of ethics, which is that in fact, and I'm using this in a sort of Marxian way, was in the paper, you know, talking about, you know, being post-Marxist in the sense that, you know, rejected a number of things, including the value theory of Marx, but the ideology theory of Marx and Althusser is really interesting. It's saying, okay, a theory can also have a role in the organization of society. And here I'm saying that ethics also has a role in the organization of society. So the argument here is very, very different from the sort of the critique of Nietzsche on ethics. Here it's really saying, okay, it might actually be a good thing to have ethics organizing society and having ethics that having a social role, but we should be clear about it. We should know about it. And so I'm basically saying that the way in which ethics constrains the ambitions, the claims, the strategies of individual member societies in the allocation game is what ethics is about. And I've given you here two pictures that I probably need to explain a little bit. The top one is a French medal in honor, which is called the Labor Medal. So if you have worked in a company for a number of years, you can actually be decorated for it. So, you know, if you save a child for drowning, you'll get one type of medals. If you work for 25 years, you'll get another type of medal, which shows actually how the ideology of ethics and the governance of work are intertwined. And then the second one is, one aspect of, clearly here, this is a very extreme case. You could actually have built a cartoon exactly the opposite way, but this is, one use, a sort of flagrant use of ethical arguments against someone in order to maintain the structure of society as it is, with someone very, very wealthy saying to someone who is not, your greed is hurting the economy, when the other person is simply asking for higher minimum wages. So that shows this sort of framework. So part of the ideology of ethics and work ethics is that work has become obligatory. I think also that, and I'll come to that in a second about equality. What we have really on equality, and the reason why equality is so important at the moment, is because equality is equality confronted to the duty to work. And then finally, I think there's in fact the ideology of ethics is really the sort of the frontier and the fault line between the sort of growing elite and the existing elite, so basically between the sort of income elite and the wealth elite, to say that in economic terms. And by broadening the range of what's socially acceptable, the income elite is going to destabilize the world of the wealth elite and actually trigger social changes. I'd like to say that, for technology is also a social construct in the same way. And in the paper I'm using actually a business concept from Christensen, which is disruptive innovations. Christensen says it in a business context, saying, okay, you're going to disrupt your competitors if you suddenly bring a new technology. It's not just disrupting competitors. There's, besides the sort of economic disruption, there's something called that we should call social disruption. And I'm giving you here the example of the iPhone. What Steve Jobs is doing on this picture, this famous speech he did, where he was repeating the 3 functions of the iPhone. I don't know how many times. I think it's 11 times. He was actually not really informing about the technology. He was boosting the social acceptability of it. And when you think of technology as a social construct, I mean, the example I give, and which I like, is the example of the barrel against the amphora during the Roman conquest of Gaul. And basically the Gauls and the Celts actually were using barrels, and the barrels are infinitely superior technologically to amphoras. They don't break as easily. They're much lighter. They can carry much more liquid, etc. Nevertheless, the Romans were able to put the barrels into oblivion and impose the amphoras in Gauls during several centuries. And that, to me, is just one example of technology as a social construct, and the fact that there's a governance of technology as there's a governance of work and the hierarchies of work. So what is all this leading to in the future? So first of all, I think jobs, I see them as a social creation first, which determines then how much can be produced. It's not really the other way around. And there, I mentioned it a bit, and I'd like to share this idea with you. I've always been surprised by, how come that equality, is so much promoted in our society, when in fact we are in a society of differentiation, of increasing differentiation, of increasing product differentiation. And artificial intelligence, the internet, for instance, are incredibly powerful tools to help us differentiate from one another much more than we could have ever been doing in the 19th century. So how come that we then have, at the same time, this drive towards equality? So one could be that, okay, it's a reaction precisely against differentiation, and that's a possible explanation. But another hypothesis I'd like to put forward is that you need equality to actually have equality of work duties, because that's part of our ideology of work ethics and of the governance of work in our society. And basically, our work system hasn't evolved sufficiently to allow the same differentiation of work as we have in terms of differentiation of consumption. But that might be coming, and that might be one of the evolutions, if you want, of the second generation of artificial intelligence. So now, with this in mind, my forecast for the future, my prediction, which, once again is only mine, is that we will finally do what Jean Baudrillard was talking about, of specializing in what's human. And the machine is going to do everything else. We're going to build relationships. We're going to conceive, we're going to design, we're going to create. We're going to govern the decision framework. We're going to set the parameters for decisions. And basically, artificial intelligence machines will do everything else. In that context, you know, who will be employed and not employed is not really a question of how many people we need to actually produce what needs to be produced in society. It's how are we going to give people a seat at the resource allocation table. And so it's there are lots of situations where we invent actually work that has not been useful, and this is not something new. I mean, think that actually in the 17th and 18th century, there were people whose whole entire life was spent in a work occupation that consisted in opening doors and closing doors. And obviously, you know, everybody can open a door. We don't need someone to open the door for us on a permanent basis. Yet that was defined. You know, the governance of work was such that that was defined as an important job, as an attribute of power for the people who employed these people. And I think we're going to see exactly the same thing happening with the development of artificial intelligence. For instance, instead of going to Starbucks and having someone who actually takes our order and then somewhere else who prepares coffee, we will actually have someone who will smile at us, say, okay, what would you like? The machine will actually understand perfectly what we like. We'll start preparing it. And at the other end, when it's ready, someone will just hand it over to us, because we need these relationships and because we see value in relationships, and that embedding relationships into products will add value to the products, even if it's not strictly necessary to the product. So that's basically the sort of the positions I wanted to present to you today. Alex, I think I'll give the floor back to you.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Very rich discussion and touching on themes that I know lots of people here want to engage with. Let's take, as usual, a 5-minute break. So come back at 50 past whatever your hour is, and have some discussion. Well, that was yeah, it was great. I think there's so much of philosophical interest there to get into. I'll have to be disciplined because there are lots of things I want to ask as well, but I will give others.
Well, we can follow up afterwards if you.
Sure, yeah, I will. But for now, I will open the floor. So, as usual, if there are junior, early career people with questions, I will give priority to them. Oh, okay. While you're gathering, I don't. Unless is it that I can't see hands, or are there no hands? All right.
I raised my hand.
Ben has a hand. Okay. Well, although you're slightly more senior than me, let's begin with you.
Thanks for making an exception for me. So this is purely clarificatory question because at first I thought I heard you say that work has to contribute something of value, an activity has to contribute something of value to society in order to count as work. But then I thought I heard you say that that's not true. So just pure clarification, which of those is your position?
Thank you. Yes, that's interesting to put these two together. I think that the conventional view is that work has to produce something of value. I think the reality of it is that it's not the case.
Okay. Well, I certainly agree with you on the second part of it. I'm not sure I know I'm not sure I'm much of an expert on what the convention is, but yeah, it sure seems to me that there are a lot of things that count as work that are just awful. Never mind neutral value-wise.
Right. If you take the sort of hyper-utilitarian view of a classical economic model, you will need to have work remunerated at its marginal utility or things like that. So you're really defining work by reference to how much value it produces.
Yeah.
And that influences at least 80% of economic work. So this is where what I'm presenting for an economist is sort of very heterodox.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Great. I think there's my head is sort of swimming with directions the conversation could go now, but maybe I'll focus my thoughts a bit more and put my hand up later.
Actually, I think I will abuse my chair and follow up that point because that's precisely what I was really interested in. I think what's most interesting about what you're doing here is that it provides an alternative to this sort of marginal product way of thinking about work, which suffers from the theoretical difficulty of well, how do you find out what the marginal product of a piece of work is, and how is the market supposed to be determining that? But secondly, I've always thought it doesn't square with our experience. I mean, if I take my own case, I have a role that I do. The remuneration was decided by some committee that decided on a national pay scale, another committee that decides on when I get promoted, the government body that allocates a certain amount of funding to this activity. And when I've worked at private organizations, it's not all that different. It's not as if there's this sort of free market where you just have everybody coming together to trade things. So I think it's really interesting to have a story based on a process of social validation being what determines these. It's a remuneration. But I guess what I'm a bit curious about is You've now, I think, separated out production almost entirely from allocation. So the marginal product theory is good because, well, your contribution to overall production then determines your access to the resources produced, the equal value of resources produced. You're now, I think, suggesting that that's the second part of that is not true. How then do you think decisions about production get made? How is production determined?
Thank you. Yes, indeed. I think I've been frustrated basically for the past 30 years at least on, as an economist, considering that the epistemology of economics has to be built in the sense that two words that are absolutely essential to economics, which are utility and work, are not defined. And basically the criticism I was addressing to Marx on his theory of value can be addressed also to the classical economic theory in terms of, that's great, you've built all this on utilities, except that utility is not really defined. So I know that Debreu has got a sort of mathematical way out, saying, well, utility in fact doesn't matter because you can mathematically, if you equate a function to an order relation. And so what we mean is that you've got a social ordering of goods. Fine. Then I'm trying to answer your question, by the way. And this is where it comes. If you have a social ordering and a complete social ordering of goods, or individual ordering and social ordering of preferences, basically, for goods, and work has a value, why doesn't this apply to work? And that, to me, is a big weakness of labor economics, because we should accept that, given that part of economics is treating labor as homogeneous. Somehow, I think we all will agree that our work is not quite equivalent to the work of a garbage collector. I don't mean that his work or her work is not useful. I mean that it's not socially recognized in the same way. It's not going to be valued in the same way, not remunerated in the same way. So there is some social determination of work. This is not recognized in most of labor economics, considering that labor is homogeneous, which it is. You don't even replace a professor of philosophy by a professor of mathematics. So there are big. We should have also an ordering, if you want, in work, and that's what I'm saying is, by the way, look, it has always existed. There's always been types of work, but this is not a complete order, which, by the way, is not the case also on the consumption side, but that's a minor weakness of the classical theory. So we would need to have basically an ordering of work, but then that's basically where I'm heading to. That's where between private activities and contributions to humanity, you will have a continuum of ordering of types of work. And you as an individual, we try to put yourself as close as possible to other contributions to humanities if the reward you're looking for is recognition, or as close as possible to maximum role in the allocation game is what you want is resources. And so I mean, you're right, you probably see that there might be two dimensions to this ordering, which, by the way, creates lots of problems in mathematical problems and stuff, but never mind. But so that's basically the sort of model I have in mind, that there's an ordering of work that needs to be included in the model, that is socially determined, that this is so important in the same way that in the economic model, in the classic economic model, I have my own utilities, I have my own preferences, and I decide my consumption on that basis, not on the basis of what's really available for other people. In the same way, I don't define my own work as what's necessary for other people, but what is going to bring me if we actually are within a utilitarian framework. And therefore, we need to have this sort of hierarchy of work, even in a utilitarian context where it's usually not presented. But then it means that the model of work needs to be much more complex than it is at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay, yeah. This is more, I mean, something that you could, in theory, model with an extension of the neoclassical model, but just with reference orderings over types of work as well as.
Yeah. That would be a neat paper to, I might try to convince colleagues to work on that with me.
Yeah. Okay, Otto, please.
Thank you very much for a very interesting paper. I guess since we spent a lot of time on defining work, maybe just spend a moment defining the word definition. And so what is the task of definition? What is the philosophical purpose of it? Are we, because you mentioned Wittgenstein or Ludwig, as you put it, one of Ludwig's great contributions to humanity, or perhaps works, depending on how you look at it, was the theory of language games. And it seems to me that work is one of those things that finds different meaning in different contexts. And one way of thinking of defining work would be to analyze those language games and say, in this context, people are using the word in this way, and it means this thing here, and a slightly different thing in this other context. So that would be kind of an anthropological almost approach to defining work as it is used in society. But I don't think that's quite what you're after here. And so I guess you would say that there's some other purpose to it. Could you perhaps clarify that a little bit? And for example, if one of the aims of defining is to exclude uses or kind of legitimate uses, then I think, for example, the case of a lone farmer who's tending the farm and producing food only for themselves, I don't think it would be crazy to say that they're working on their farm, even if they're only working for themselves. So I just want to ask about the language games issue, and do you think that these boundaries are, how tight are they? Thanks.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I have a solution in mind, which I alluded to in the paper and didn't really present here. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. My reference framework here would be type logic. And that basically, but type logic built with subtypes as well. So basically what I'm looking for is, okay, if we're in type logic, I want to have a type that's called work or labor to be able to work with that. Because as long as I haven't got that, I can't build anything logical around it. And basically what we have at the moment is in some ways a fuzzy logic, a fuzzy type logic, which is horrible conceptually, but sort of having an ill-defined type on the basis of which economists are building mathematical models. So how can you build mathematical rigor on the basis of ill-defined logical types? That's where I'm going.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Graham.
Hi, thank you for that. I wonder if you could perhaps expand a little bit on your description of private activities. Within that, you seem to put within there domestic labour and therefore exclude domestic labour from work as an activity. I think that domestic labour, by doing so, it's excluding women in many parts of the world from being perceived as being workers. So could you expand on that, please?
Yes, it's not me. It's actually society that does that. I think, first of all, there is very, very rarely remuneration for that, which shows that, it's not valued in the same way. Their inclusion in economic models is patchy, to say the least. And there's really a problem of definition of border between this and this is a very, very important issue in development economics and in development in general, because we would need to have a much clearer understanding of this interface between work and private activities to be able to have, this would inform development theories and development policies quite substantially, because at the moment, and part of the problem is the lack of information about what is really contained in the private activities, precisely because they're private. And so there's a whole set of informational issues, there's a whole set of social issues linked to that. So I certainly didn't mean that this situation of putting these activities outside the work sphere are desirable. I was also mentioning that to me it's more a continuum, and you've got sort of preferences. And there, thank you, because I think you're bringing another dimension which is really interesting, that in private activities you really have another dimension which is real preference, which is desirability, and some are chores and some are leisure, and here as well we probably have a continuum between this, and we would need to bring that other dimension into an already complex picture to be able to cater for what you're talking about. But indeed, this in the same way that the distinction between contributions to humanity and work is not always perfect, and sometimes society doesn't recognize a contribution to humanity until 200 years later. There's clearly a lack of social recognition of the non-desired private activities, but because they're not remunerated, because they're sort of done not quite on the voluntary basis, but at will, they're rarely categorized at work, at least in models, in statistical analysis, etc. And very rarely are they really addressed in the same way in any analysis of labor.
On that point, I guess something some feminist economists are trying to work on is getting beyond the household as the fundamental unit in modeling, because obviously domestic labor just disappears entirely inside the household.
Yeah, but by the way, I think that's where artificial intelligence is a game changer.
Yeah.
Because for instance, I don't vacuum my living room. I've got a robot doing that. At the moment, the robot doesn't collect information about it, but it could. We will soon have fridges that will be able to assess what needs to be replaced on the basis. That's why I was saying that, not saying that we will be making decisions, but more that we will set the parameters for decisions, because basically the fridges will be reordering automatically. Once we start having that artificial intelligence linked to private activities will be able to have more data on it, but of course there are a number of privacy issues in the way.
It depends who's building this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, that leads sort of to the next question I wanted to ask, which is I think also relevant to something that Darren has been working on. So at the end, I think you presented this picture, which is quite useful as a framing exercise. You imagine a world where production is fully automated, output is produced without human labor, in effect. And if you can imagine a world like this, we then have this question of how are we going to allocate this output. The UBI type might say, well, everyone just gets a certain share of it. That's one way that we could do it. Another way is we could say humans have to participate in certain activities which may not be necessary for production, but are in some way socially valuable, and your access is proportionate to your contribution there. And maybe that's a little bit like a participation income or something along those lines. Then I guess one question, which is not very philosophically interesting, but I guess it has to be answered, is we don't have labor markets anymore, at least not in the recognizable form. So what's the procedure by which society determines whether someone has made the right sort of contribution to deserve a particular share of production?
That's a really interesting aspect. In parallel, it's, as you say, not really a philosophical debate, but maybe it ought to be. In the human resources literature, and Graham will be familiar with that, there are tons and tons of discussions on how to do performance management, and there's a new trend in a number of companies which is not doing performance management because actually it does more harm than good. So this is, there's never been an ideal solution in terms of us being able to assess the quality of work. Also because work is multidimensional. You take a philosopher. A philosopher might be an excellent lecturer and not such a great researcher, or vice versa. So if your job involves both research and teaching, how do you assess that? And how then, and it's always in society a question of ranking, precisely because there's this sort of missing, sort of labor ordering. How are you going to assess the preferences, the performance of someone who is average at both compared to someone who is outstanding at research and not very good at teaching, or outstanding at teaching and not very good at research? So basically, we're again in a preference issue, but it's actually what the utilitarians have always shied away from, although their model implies it, which is preference between people and preferences for some people. It's problematic because if you push it at the extreme, you get into forms of discriminations which none of us on this call would want to see. At the same time, not recognizing that there are preferences is also problematic.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. Ben?
I think you've sort of answered my question since several minutes ago when I put my hand up. But let me see. But this is, sort of I got to actively update my thinking as you share, as you sort of clarify your ideas. So I guess I would want to follow up on the last thing you said about it being problematic not to take people's preferences into account. So I mean, so capitalism is a great preference or not preference really, actually, I guess desire would be a better, anyway, a great desire satisfaction machine. And it's, you know, that's wonderful for in some ways and awful in other ways. And it seems when we talk about remunerating work in some other way than through the market, we're not going to let markets determine people's income anymore. What is the case for still allowing people's preferences into the deliberation? Because if you allow people's preferences into the way capitalism does, you've got this great sort of this great information transmission sort of benefit that was central to Hayek's argument for free markets. Yeah. So we're going to still use people's preferences, but not in the way the markets use people's preferences. So we're not, this sort of information transmission function is not going to be part of the case for taking people's preferences into account. What remains of the case? What remains of the case for caring about people's preferences?
So, yeah, freedom is a big one, but actually, several, you know, your remarks inspire me several comments. I mean, the first one is, I'm not sure that capitalism is a great desire satisfaction machine. It's great at satisfying the preferences of consumers. We can discuss whether it's great at satisfying the preferences of workers or work-related preferences. And it's, I think, even more doubtful that it's great at maximizing either social preferences or sort of society's, you know, social groups' preferences, and also the preferences precisely between people. In what I mean by that is, to take a trivial example, you have situations where you know, a factory owner will really like you know, people working with her, except that she has to actually, because of capitalism, etc., she has to reduce the number of people working with her, and she will have to fire 3 of them. And she might actually have very good relationships with these 3. So I think actually, I'm not sure that capitalism is actually so good at preserving relationships. So that's a dimension which is a little bit missing. The second thing which your remarks inspire me is, I'm not sure I want to live in an alternative to my free expression of preferences. You can always, I'm not going to start the debate on free will and whether it exists or not, but I'm a little bit frightened by the artificial intelligence alternative. You know, even Amazon already becomes sort of frighteningly close to that. Yeah.
Can I jump in? I guess I didn't mean to be making a case against, or even suggest, or even asking you to defend allowing people to express their preferences. Certainly not. The first thing you said in response to my question was, well, it's a matter of freedom. So maybe I misunderstood your position, but yes, I mean, I guess it is a freedom of sort to be able to sort of express one's preferences, but the kind of system you're talking about is not going to really involve acting on them in any sense. Because because maybe again, maybe I misunderstand what you're envisioning here, but I take it you're envisioning sort of that everybody's preferences get sort of fed into a sort of preference aggregator kind of. Well, not everybody's preferences, everybody's valuations. I'm sorry, you know,
Yeah, I mean, this is happening. Look at Amazon. If you or you know Facebook, or at one point when I arrived in this country 8 years ago, I was getting adverts that were, you know, let's say, I won't elaborate, but were contrary to my values, and I started training the system. You know, you can say whether you like the ad or not, or you could at that time. I trained it, and 3 weeks later, it suggested a book to me that I hadn't bought on Amazon, and this was because that book had been written by a close friend of mine who had sent me, you know, a free copy of it. So that's the level we're already reaching. So if you want, this artificial intelligence is already able, on the basis of your searches, on the basis of your behaviors, to be incredibly close to your desires. And so that's where I think somehow I think philosophers really have to defend and make the case for freedom and for liberty, because we really risk getting into a system where everything will be sort of determined, but then it will be so. The problem is who's controlling the algorithms that determine this, and if they're controlled by the producers, as is currently the case, that might end up being quite problematic, because there's nothing more tempting for producers than to go into monopoly positions. And so you can start, you know, restricting the choice. I hope that actually artificial intelligence makes this more difficult, because if you restrict the choice, somebody else will open it because it's relatively easy to do. But I think we are getting into the post-capitalist world with artificial intelligence. I'm not sure that this has really been realized yet. And I don't think it's an egalitarian system that's coming. It's a more differentiated system, except that we'll have more powerful tools to differentiate absolutely everything.
Thank you.
Yanis.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question about, let's say, a Marxian reading of your talk, right? Because it's not the reductionist Marxist reading of productivism, right? You're opposing exactly that. You're saying, let's not think about work as in terms of output, yeah? That what doesn't at all capture what's going on, but rather let's take a cultural Marxist interpretation of what's going on, right? That the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling classes, and one reason we don't have a definition of work is, because work is something that is defined by often enough the ruling classes in a way that fits their governance schemes, right? So this is what I think you offer as a key for understanding work in a different way, that we don't get distracted by a fetishization of production and output and so on and so forth. And once we see this whole discussion about work as a tool of social hierarchical control, we might be free to see that we can now potentially have more influence on reshaping it than before, even as you say, the amount of work that we might need to physically carry out is reducing. So is this what you're suggesting then a type of ideology critique, really, or have I misunderstood it?
No, thank you. This is really interesting. Yes, I've got an ambiguous relationship with Marx, as you've rightly pointed out. And in fact, one thing which really influenced me are the last 2 pages of the Capital, not book 1, which is, to me, far too monolithic. But precisely, the very last lines that Marx writes are, okay, we haven't really got a world where you've got capitalists and workers. We've got lots of situations in between. And so what happens then? And somehow what I was developing here is a form of answer to this last Marxian question. So it's not using the sort of Marxist dialectic in any way. And so that's why I'm saying I'm post-Marxist. But in the same way that you would have postmoderns, if you want, that you accept that a number of things have been, a number of questions have been set, a number of things have been set, but you're looking at it, with a completely different, analytical framework, which is exactly what I'm doing. But in some ways, I think in his last words, he asked the right question, which is, okay, when we have actually a society with continuums of preferences, how is the social dynamics developing?
Great. Any final questions, thoughts for Bertrand? Okay, well, I'll move over to Gathertown, and maybe others will as well. We can continue informally for people who'd like. But I found this a really fruitful workshop, so I'm grateful to all of you. I hope you did as well. As I say, you can go on the website, you can find all of the talks on YouTube, which I've hopefully done properly. Other than that, yeah, you know how to join the network on the website, so you'll then get emails about various things we're doing, including the next workshop, which we haven't chosen a theme for or planned yet. But if you have thoughts, please do get in touch and let us know. Maybe I'll see some of you in the botanical gardens that created. Otherwise, hopefully at another event. Thanks very much.
Also, just wanted to say a big thank you to Alex and Ben for organizing.
Absolutely.
Mostly Alex.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.